And now, our feature presentation.
Go explore.
Oh, cow!
Dora the Explorer.
Resident Evil 4.
2004 was a year in history when we got introduced to Facebook, the new cutting-edge way to socialize with the World Wide Web.
What compelled you to do this?
It would be easier to find a girlfriend if I could just search in a database for what I wanted.
Personally, I don't think it'll overtake Friendster, so I consulted with a good friend of mine to see if I should invest the rest of my savings to get some more shares.
Hey, what's going on?
I was just wondering, you think now is a good time to invest in Friendster?
In Friendster?
Yeah.
No, it is not a good time to invest in Friendster.
While Leon Kennedy's quest for the president's daughter also took place in 2004, the game didn't hit store shelves for us until early 2005, basically because the game was busy morphing itself into various new and different intellectual properties. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here because $20 is $20. While Chris was busy disobeying the law on the brother-sister anime, Notice Me, Veronica-senpai, Leon's life was completely derailed by the government. After 4 years on the inside, he gets paired up with a roided-up soldier, and the two find some Incan girl injected with the Veronica virus. The only virus that doesn't seem to completely zap the sanity out of its host. This guy gets infected and Leon doesn't seem concerned at all about his well-being. They save this new anime superwoman, and we essentially never hear from her again. Almost like this was all to retroactively set the stage for future events.
Remember me?
Krauser.
1 year later, the first two protagonists, who are technically the second two protagonists, are on a mission to finally put an end to Umbrella by destroying some Russian facility. You know, Leon's goal. Wesker also infiltrates the facility for the sole purpose of stealing the Red Queen program, the thing that originated in the films, but was cool enough to port itself over to the canon story. Per usual, the duo finds a tyrant model, and Wesker runs into his old pals, Comrade Cloud and Gay Morpheus. Only now he's got a fabulous twin with blue glasses. The duo successfully managed to kill the new monstrosity because guns will never not be effective in this universe, and Wesker kills this game's original characters to set him up for future events. This all happened as a shiny new city erected in the middle of the ocean comes under assault by what's likely the most effective bioorganic weapon, and the most useless bioorganic weapon. The suavest motherfucker on the block, a shameless flirt, and this guy can't really contain the outbreak. So they shoot their way out of the city before the sun causes it to collapse to the ground. At least that's what I think happens. The monsters just start evaporating when the city just starts collapsing. Another anime superwoman is evacuated before the total collapse, but she's not really important now. Or later. She might, but I think we're just starting over, so she's probably been forgotten among other characters who were supposed to have the torch passed to them. I think they were doing the all-female reboot thing of Wesker since his wife was a pedophile. Not as big as Claire, but she's up there. Now that I think about it, the protagonist and antagonist torch was passed to a Wesker. So this guy would have had to confront his mom, who's younger than him, because she mind transfer jutsu'd her brain into a 7-year-old. When exactly did Wesker even find time to get married? He dies in 6 years and his wife isn't made up by the developers until well after he fuses with the Earth. I think he's single now, and there's pretty much going to be no reference to her whatsoever. Did he meet her in Russia? Was it in Africa? Was it sometime in the States? How'd they even meet? He was pretty focused on his work. Maybe he's just a Sasuke of the story. We already have a Naruto and Hinata. And Wesker definitely doesn't seem like he's the type to show affection, so he probably just took this woman on to pass his genes. He high-key had a god complex, so why would he go and share it? Unless he... like... oh wow, no. I'm just way off the mark. Why didn't I just edit the script to have the correct backstory? So Leon's in rural Europe. The president's daughter has been kidnapped, and he's gotta bring her some home, with the help of his behind-the-scenes support team, a local cop, and an entrepreneur. A one-man job for the field. The role of partner character this time is technically Yoko's older sister, trying to procure a virus from enemy hands. 2 entirely separate missions, and like a mutual understanding to help each other out when able. This is Resident Evil 4, one of the greatest third-person shooters ever made. The game had a crazy development cycle, to put it bluntly. So crazy that RE4 managed to spawn some new IPs. But when all is said and done, the game that hit store shelves was certainly very familiar in terms of its mechanics. When you see the kinds of things that came out of the grindstone, and how different these games play, it's probably a blessing that the only major change to the game's core mechanics are the camera and aiming systems. If we look at movement, for example, it's pretty much a one-to-one copy of a classic title like RE3, the remake, or Zero. Leon still has tank movement. He still defaults to walking and runs with a button press, he has the 180-degree turn, and he must still stop when aiming and shooting. His other ancillary actions are near one-to-one port as well. He can still search, observe, and interact with the world around him via context-sensitive button prompts. He can still examine and combine items in the menu, and he still has visual ways of representing his health despite being displayed on the screen. He has a little more to him than this, but for the most part, our protagonist remains untouched. I know Outbreak wasn't the most popular title with fans, but I would have still guessed they would have kept those games' basic movement and control changes. The 2 big ones being the full 360-degree movement and the ability to move and shoot at the same time. The new movement came about because full 3D environments meant less jump cutting from the camera, which would end up really distorting your intended movement if you pass through a lot of scenes quickly. Outbreak still had jump cuts, but they were far less frequent than older games since the camera could track the player more effectively. RE4 doesn't require tank controls since your view is always fixed, meaning there's 100% certainty in where you'll move when you press a direction. To compromise things, you could have allowed full 360-degree movement by default, and reinstate tank controls when Leon is aiming the gun. This of course would mean you'd have to allow Leon to move and shoot at the same time to compensate for the constant shifting of directions. I mean, you don't have to, but it'd be pretty annoying if your only option of backing away was turning around completely. This was something already implemented, so they should have a feel for how fast you'd be allowed to move. While you could get the game working that way, I actually think the tank controls are the right call for this setup, despite not really being necessary for the game to function properly. It allows you to keep threats on screen while also playing the important role of reeling in Leon's movement. Environments are already more open-ended, so if Leon could just easily zip out of the way, even more so than he already can, it would work as an indirect debuff to enemies. They'd have to be tweaked to compensate for his ease of movement. If you change this, dodging an axe, a giant fist, a dog, or the thing that's in the sewers would literally require a simple press to the left or the right to completely evade the arc of their attack. With the controls as they are now, it makes Leon easy enough to pick up and use, but also grants some more leeway to enemy design. They don't all have to be super hyperactive, throwing out multiple hitboxes just to have a snowball's chance at hitting the guy. More conventional movement and slow enemies can demonstrably work, but for this open-ended level design, I think these controls are better suited for the enemies on offer. Also supplementing the mechanical change is the shift to a more action-oriented approach on the moment-to-moment gameplay. Now I'm definitely on record hating these kinds of changes that push for firefights over puzzle solving, so it's probably fair to think I consider this shift in design a bad thing, like I just inherently consider puzzles good and shooting inherently bad. But that's not the case, so I'm going to detail why the shift to firefights here is a good thing compared to when certain other games do it. Now with the old mechanics, handling enemy swarms wasn't preferred since the games relied on auto-targeting and your view of the world was heavily obstructed by the camera. Auto-targeting was the most reliable way to engage an enemy, and you'd always target the enemy closest to you, which limits your choices in combat. You can't prioritize targets if your character always opts to shoot the thing closest to them. And toggling between targets can cost too much time when dealing with a more aggressive enemy type. The camera placement meant that nearby enemies could be off screen, so maneuvering around a contained space with more than a few of them could come off as cheap. This is why any sort of mob is placed in an area where the camera doesn't need to make that many cuts. That's less of a chance you'll just warp into an enemy's grip. It's usually just 1 to 3 enemies occupying a section of a room, giving you some space to evade if you so choose. Unless you're some select situations, or Resident Evil 3. The classic titles definitely had aspirations of being an action shooter, but they couldn't effectively act on that urge. Ammo wasn't exactly super scarce, they rewarded you with special guns, and infinite ammo was also a carrot to the player, incentivizing replays of the shooting galleries. You weren't exactly dissuaded from engaging, but the mechanics were definitely better suited to exploration, just looking around and solving riddles, which is why the developers wisely focused on that aspect for those titles. Instead of firefights, enemies just put some stress on exploration, doubling as a sort of strategy element since they would cost a limited resource to dispense of. With the camera now at your back, you can move more comfortably and engage enemies with a variety of methods, meaning low-level threats aren't really a sweat if they're too low in number. If Leon only came across 1 or 2 zombies as he was working through a puzzle, it'd be almost comical. They wouldn't cause you any stress or any fear. You'd probably just shoot, stab, kick them, and go back to what it is you're trying to solve. I definitely know you can keep higher quality puzzles with this setup, but the majority of the mechanics are now better suited to enemy engagement, so the design shifts accordingly. Leon is very much buffed in this department since he can aim anywhere instead of down, middle, and up. He has context-sensitive combat actions, as well as an effective knife. Low-level threats tend to show up in clusters, so they have a better chance to overwhelm him. This also makes the management gameplay side of things function correctly. Enemies were always there to drain your resources so you wouldn't feel completely safe or overconfident in exploration. It only took a few of them to make newer players choose to expend ammo since running by was a risky prospect with the clunky movement. The circumstances now require that number to be considerably higher to create the same effect. So if Leon wants the area zombie-free, he typically won't be left with much ammo to spare, preserving that feeling one might have exploring in the classic titles. Because the count for basic enemies now has to be higher in order to function as a valid threat, this naturally creates more firefighting scenarios. However, the player is not always forced to engage. Sometimes you definitely are, but in actuality the classic style lock and key puzzles are still very much at work here. They now just mainly resemble their end-of-game selves from the classic series. There's no mansion, there's no police station, there's no city, there's no incest twins. Instead, every puzzle you encounter is self-contained to its area. I mean, in the village section, there's a locked door with its key placed very far away from its location, and I guess you do need this guy's eye for a door you come across, and these plates for this fancy door. But you're all but led to this stuff with the game design. There's not much wandering around an area and gradually opening up a space. Instead, you'll get encounters like this in the ravine. It's populated with low-level threats which you can choose to evade as you always could. The thing standing in your way is a locked door, which requires you finding 2 halves of a key to combine into a usable one. As long as you meet that requirement, you're free to proceed. Some people will conclude that you need to fight everything because that's just what they're used to in modern shooters, but others will catch on. Take the maze as another example. It's the same premise, but the layout helps elevate the immediate threat level since more agile enemies can attack you from any point without warning, and you can easily be overwhelmed if you choose evasion as your primary method, meaning you have to balance combat and evasion depending on ammo reserves. However, if you can manage to explore the space and get the required keys, you're free to proceed. It's not a forced firefight. Sewer section is the same thing. If you can drain the water and skedaddle on by without killing everything, more power to you. This type of design basically mimics any other puzzle you'd find in the later sections of a classic Resident Evil. A door stands in your way, so you comb through the immediate area looking for the thing you need, engaging with enemies as necessary. Because the mechanics now favor combat, the puzzles have been merely altered so that more natural and engaging firefights occur as a result. Sometimes the firefights are played up when the designers feel like they have a compelling layout, such as the initial village, which is sprawling, the cabin, which contains you to a small space, the castle room that locks you in with 2 tough enemies and 4 jobbers, that one mine-carting segment. This thing had good ideas coming out its ass. The difference between this change and this change is that the other half of its mechanics, being puzzle solving, isn't completely thrown to the wayside. In fact, it's used in a way to complement its stronger set of mechanics. They've still taken a hit in terms of difficulty, but what we get in return for this alteration are moments like the castle infiltration where we not only have to guard Ashley, but set up a cannon to blow our way through a door. Or pushing ahead through a freezer, which requires some card keys that can be altered to open up new areas, with some of the most threatening enemies in the game blocking your path. Simple puzzles, but under heavy pressure. Then you have moments that simply reward you for looking around, like the optional gem puzzle, which is nonsensical at first until you piece together the solution by the gravestones. Or remembering a window that was too high to reach that you come back to later on with your escort for a free gun. And this one's really out of the way, you'd have to actively be going for this secret. Not to mention hidden optional treasures which reward you with currency, something very valuable in the game. Then there's the literal classic style puzzle, like getting a cryptic message before turning a sequence of pictures, matching light rays, or making a clear image with tile turning. The puzzles in Resident Evil 4 haven't gone anywhere, nor did they segregate themselves from the main game. The majority are a requirement, as they've always been. They didn't vanish, leaving the game to become lock character in room, spam with enemies, then proceed 100% of the time. It's all here. It's just packaged to complement what the game does best. Add on to the fact that this game's firefight spits on its contemporaries and future competitors, and well, you'll see. We'll get there. To summarize, the game mechanically nearly mirrors its predecessors on the control front, but a simple tweak to the camera and level design has altered basic enemy frequency and puzzle layout. For what we are presented, we have a very strong and focused title despite its failings on other fronts. Now, I'm probably one of the worst people you've ever heard try to talk about a game's story, or stories in general. I usually just end up summarizing the thing or pointing out some glaring writing inconsistency. Shit, I usually end up thinking poorly written stories are okay because the voice acting was competent, only to have it explained to me why that's just not the case. Or if it's really silly in my kind of way, I'm just like, oh, neat. Story can definitely affect the quality of a game, especially if that's its main focal point, as has sadly become the norm for high budget games. But I also think it doesn't hold as much weight on the overall product. This is a tangent, by the way, excuse me. Fucking pants are gonna have piss all over them by the time I'm done with this. Why can't I just make like a 15-minute video and get paid billions of dollars? Just fucking say like, Resident Evil 4 is the best game ever. Leon's hair is better than Justin Timberlake in the Social Network. Then they'll say, who the fuck is Justin Timberlake? Nobody knows what you're talking about, Grandma. And I'll say, the game just has like tons of secrets. Tons of motherfucking secrets. Taught me investment banking. Can't suck its dick too hard, though. Gotta say some stupid criticism. Something really non-committal. Something people won't contest. The game's kind of old now. And, we have new things, and newer things are new. And that's why old things are old, you know? Because you know. I think I'm tangenting about why I don't think story is that important.
Wake up.
I mean, I know I'm literally just regretting my life right now. So for this medium, I pretty much weight things with 4 fundamental blocks. The first is how the game controls, like how good does it feel to move around in the world around you? Is it stop on a dime perfect? Are things intuitive? Are all actions executed okay, or are some a little sloppy? How does the camera play into this? Does it get in the way? Is it seamlessly woven into the controls? Basically, how well does your game handle? Then from there you go on to things like if it's just doing the bare minimum, or if it has these little movement subtleties that aren't super fucking complex to pull off, which works reliably but adds more mechanical depth. This translates to more options to bait someone or letting you gain that last bit of hype for a jump. The small stuff. I'd argue control is the most important thing for a game to perfect. It's the bedrock. Design whatever world you want. Make the game look as good as money can buy. Put fucking Citizen Kane in your game and move me to tears. None of that shit matters if you can't get this basic concept right. This goes for the most complex action game to the most basic bitch walking story sim. You don't ever want control to just intrinsically feel wrong. When it does, it ruins the effort of everybody else. It's like the most likely thing to make someone stop playing, especially if they feel like they're being cheated or if they feel like they're fighting the controls more than their opponent. Movement and control is the foundation. The next thing I would weigh nearly as important as the game's movement is the game's level design. The world in which is going to take advantage of the game's movement. I've already said this, but if you make fucking Super Mario and he's just a dream to control, like he side flips into the perfect position to start jerking you off, that effort's nearly all for nothing if the world around your character does not effectively take advantage of what they can do. So if, say, the level you throw Mario in is just like a flat desert, nothing else, you've got a lot of wasted potential. There's all this cool shit he can do because he can run and jump and flip and possess things, but then you make your game about giving him missions to like explore this pile of sand and press A over a shiny hole to get a star. Then the game maybe becomes some woods where you walk around and do the same thing. They just keep asking you to inspect random stuff. Sure, everything's right about Mario and it feels good to move him around, but what you're doing isn't capitalizing on a skill set. Or maybe you just have this hypothetical character, let's just call her like Lara Croft. She can do a lot of interesting things like attach ropes to objects for the purpose of traversal, or use the same mechanic to create platforms or move them around the world, or use it for time-sensitive scenarios. Maybe they can burn certain items and free climb certain surfaces. The world around them presents opportunities for these mechanics to play off each other in some kind of meaningful and intricate way, but they're like, hey, the character can shoot, so let's throw in some chodes in there and call it a day. When you specify a skill set for a character, the world around them better take advantage of everything they've got. And based on what the character can do, the worlds can be as complex as necessary. Hell, some games which only have one, count 'em, one, single but well-developed mechanic can effectively use that one mechanic to make the world around the player engaging and challenging. The more you have to account for, the more thought you're going to have to put into this stuff. I know that's asking a lot when you spend millions of dollars, but that's what you sign up for. These two aspects of the game, control and an effective world, are what I'd argue are the most important thing for your abomination creation to have. If you got these two things, you can theoretically have a game where, say, a single American goes to rural Europe, shit talks everybody he meets, has his own personal businessman follow him around, and rides off into the sunset with a young ballistic woman. If people are engaged, chances are they're having fun, and these other pillars of design will not impact their experience as severely as flubbing a well-controlled and well-designed game would. The next fundamental block of design a person will typically judge a game by is its presentation, its graphics. If you have the game where it counts, then a nice appealing coat of paint is what brings that person in, and can help emphasize some design aspects. This can really help the world around the player, smartly cluing them off to what they're supposed to be doing, or just be strong artistic pieces in their own right. Top-notch graphics are certainly not the straw that breaks the camel's back, however. More modest-looking titles and older titles that have been one-upped in every conceivable way in the looks department are still thoroughly enjoyed, because they have it where the game counts. They've got a grip on their mechanics, and they know how to design a world around it that pulls you in with its engagement. Obviously, it's nice if you can mesh cutting-edge graphics with top-notch gameplay, but it's not required. The last pillar of judgment, and what I'd argue holds the least amount of influence for an engaging game, is its story. And that's not just because games have gotten by with little to no narrative in the past, it's by virtue of the medium. If you pick up that controller, you're there to engage with something. You expect to be part of an experience. When the game asks you to hold off for a moment, you're pretty much gambling that what you're writing has a universal appeal and will serve as a way to propel the player into wanting to further engage with your game. And that's a very tough balance to strike. How much conventional story is too much? How frequently is it going to intervene? Every stage? Every so often as significant landmarks? Every 5 seconds? How can you gauge when it's only serving to pull a person out rather than pull a person in?
But first, let me tell you a story.
No thanks. See ya!
I think the smarter storytellers ahead of the curve utilize the medium for themselves and have the player engagement itself do the business of the plot. You could say you're even more successful when the player doesn't even have to engage with the story, but willingly seeks it out because your world building was that enticing. They wanted to see what happened next, so they sought it out. And as a result, you get your story, and the player doesn't feel intruded upon. It's like that person that rereads books to pick up on themes. Anyway, that's what I would describe as a video game story done well. I'm not saying conventional presentation has no place, but this new medium allows for so many things other storytelling methods just can't do. There's so much more proactivity to be had here, and it's sad that story creativity has fallen wayside to herder imitate movies. Look at our cast and acting talent, so diverse. We sure are nailing that cinematic pacing. Make sure to slap any kind of gameplay in between with no thought as to what it adds, because it's good enough now at the highest level. I'm glad your trilogy is over, you fucking... The narrative written well will definitely pull you in, and push you to keep putting more hours into the game.
Can I touch you?
Touch me?
I'd even argue that when a story resonates with you, you'll put up with some really bad gameplay decisions, just to keep watching the characters. But that's gotta be hard to achieve when trying to appeal to the masses. And there's definitely a line crossed if the game simply isn't competent enough to justify it. The story is what you add to the game when it's got a solid foundation on all other fronts. The hard part is working with other portions of development so it doesn't feel like it's tacked on, but rather an integral part of the experience that strengthens all other design aspects. This is probably the toughest one to get right, and it's definitely the one that stands the least to provide a solid experience on its own merit. Because if it did, then why on earth are you playing a game instead of just watching something on your iPhone with the cracked screen? If I had to put a number in terms of its importance, some arbitrary shit like 45% to control, 35% weighted to the world, 15% weighted to looking good and elevating the world to that next level, and 5% to integrating the narrative. Basically, if your story just completely fails, you can still have a solid game in every other regard. And that's why we don't fucking care about the story when it's dumb like Mario Brothers, or obscure the aftermath.
Hey dude, go stare at somebody else. How about coming to my bedroom? I've got some Barry White and vodka.
Do you have a waterbed?
The graphics could just be a dog turd, but if you have a solid foundation, that shit can stand. You'll have a rough time trying to pull people in, but hey, your game works. If you fuck up on either of the other two bedrocks, that's when you start getting slammed. Why'd I say all this? I think I was trying to explain why I only just touch on a game's story as opposed to the other elements. It's pretty much why. I don't consider them that important. They have importance, but not that important.
Touch me? Well, sure, if you like.
As I've already stated, the game's mechanical changes meant it was better suited to combat scenarios. So what's going on here that makes this gunplay so fucking addicting? Honestly, it's so basic. And it's sad how many other games just get it completely wrong, or do the bare minimum to make a functional shooter.
You're mine!
It's literally the fact that Leon handles well, has tactical options, and the enemies take advantage of all of this. So let's go over Leon right quick. His standard set is a handgun and knife. The handgun functions identical to last time. It pinpoints one enemy, it can stun them occasionally, it takes about half its clip to get the job done when purely going for the gun kill, it has a tough time performing crowd control.
Oh, you can fuck up. I'm gonna get my knife out. Fuck off! Get away!
However, it can still retain most of its power shooting at distances, so it's a good mid-range weapon. The knife has relatively quick attack speed, it's likely to stun default enemies, and sets up Leon for other attacks, giving it even more of a buff than last time around. Hell, it can actually function with a couple of enemies, but it's definitely not safe for crowd control or long-ranged attacks. Then you get a shotgun, the go-to weapon whenever you start feeling swarmed. It doesn't pack a punch at ranged targets, and its ammo isn't as abundant as a handgun. However, at close range you can really fuck up single targets, so it both functions as crowd control to set up for other attacks, or as a power weapon to use on stronger targets. The machine guns boast the same effective range as a handgun, only it can dish out damage much quicker. It gets better at doing crowd control depending on its clip size, but its role of mid-range weapon is pretty much the same as a handgun. The rifles are obviously for long-range encounters and allow you to stay very far away from having your head shoved up your ass. They also have high-powered rounds, making their damage output the second highest in the game, meaning it's also a solid choice for boss encounters or stronger enemy variants. The trade-off is that you're forced into a scope every time you want to shoot, lower ammo drop rates, and a slower rate of fire compared to your other arms. The last weapon subset Leon can have are magnums, which boast the highest power in the game and can easily fuck up most enemies. They're also as easy to use as your standard handgun, so they effectively function as a get out of jail for not paying child support card. The catch is that their ammo drop rate is incredibly rare, de-incentivizing their casual use. The shit's for the big boys. He also has grenades, which serve as quick but limited crowd control, finisher, and paralyzer, but his primary combat means are his firearms, not to downplay the tactical decisions grenades bring to the table. There's lastly that important tweak to Leon's skill set, which comes in the form of context-sensitive commands. If an enemy is in a certain state, he can kick them or end their life. On top of this, engaging in these commands grants him vulnerability, as well as functions as another option for crowd control should the situation call for it. Leon is very strongly designed here, with plenty of combative options at his disposal, as well as clearly defined strengths and weaknesses. It's just so fucking easy to intuit that players don't even have to be told what weapons to use on what occasions. It's like basic common sense to not use a rifle at close range or throw a grenade at one enemy. Even the brand new players I enlisted all stuck to their mid-range weapons until a change was called for.
Well, I'm gonna shoot him before he runs away. And hopefully he blows up. Whoa, 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 dude, what the hell? No!
He has it where it counts, and his mechanics will allow for very creative ways to engage with enemies. This effort would go to complete dog shit if the enemies didn't take advantage of these combat mechanics effectively. So let's see what we've got, as far as non-boss enemies go. The most common enemy type is your standard Ganado. That doesn't make any fucking sense. These guys have palette swaps depending on which area you're in, but they come in the same general subgroups, with a few minor gameplay tweaks here and there. Depending on what they're holding, they serve different combat niches. Firstly is your run-of-the-mill schmuck that's unarmed. Their primary role is to get close and hold you down for an old-fashioned beating. They exert close-range pressure on you, but besides that, they're mostly harmless enemies on their own. The next type holds some common weapon. Could be a farm tool or some medieval type shit, but their purpose is to get in close and attack. They mix in well with the unarmed Ganados, but they also serve as close-range pressure. The next type will tend to hold back and attack from a distance. Easier variants just spawn farm tools and try to hurl them at you, while tougher variants will use proper ranged weapons from old school crossbows to proper firearms. Easier variants can have their attacks snuffed out of the air with a well-placed shot, but their presence still means that your attention has to expand beyond your immediate area. The close range and long range variants are balanced in that the direct attackers don't lunge at you right away. Your movement limitation is considered. Instead, they'll usually just quickly close the distance, then slowly approach you, giving you time to make your attack or fend off attacks at a range. However, the immediate threat can be just what the enemy needs to land a hit on you from a distance, and vice versa. The next type are less frequent, but they find their way in here and there. They hold dynamite and serve as more severe mid-ranged attackers as well as potential kamikaze candidates. They attempt to snuff out the strategy of just trying to wall yourself into a small corner since they damage everything in their immediate area. As you progress, Granados will attempt various forms of shielding, which turns them into a less threatening bullet sponge compared to outright tougher enemies. This goes further towards combating against simply trying to put enemies in a line and playing from a corner for easy headshots since they can't easily be stunned or dispatched of. The design of the world also assists in this regard, ensuring to keep one-way entrances and exits to a minimum so enemies can't easily be cheated. It encourages you to keep on the move. The most important variant of the standard enemy is the Plagas types. Now this is Resident Evil 4, and you've basically been trained since your inception that headshots are the way to go in these types of zombie situations. The developers understand that they basically handed you a convenient and easy to use set of mechanics to shoot people in the face. That's where this shit comes in. Now avoiding headshots doesn't exactly prevent them from spawning less, which would have helped create some more decision making, but their inclusion is pretty important to the ebb and flow of battle. When a Plagas spawns, the range of the enemy's close quarters attack increase, they become harder to put down with bullets, and most importantly, they create choices because of the way they play off your arsenal, specifically with Flash Grenade. If you're touting around one of these puppies, then it's an instant kill on any Plagas type enemy. The value of this easy kill then turns into a simple choice. Do you waste it on the enemy as soon as it pops out, or do you try to weed out as many as you can for the most effective kill? When environments close off, it becomes harder to get the max bang for your buck, but the quick kill could end up saving your life. Playing the odds means you basically got to deal with the more pressing threat while other ones could potentially still be active. Not only that, but you're willingly increasing the immediate difficulty for the promise of a more economical kill. Depending on your environment, this would mean you're still susceptible to range attacks from enemies, or maybe you just don't have the space to work with to use your arsenal effectively instead of being forced to play from a state of panic, or maybe you're forced to expend ammo you don't want to. Luckily, context-sensitive actions can turn potentially overwhelming scenarios into scenarios that work out in your favor. Because Leon's kick works on whole gangs, allowing them to group up and stunning one for a quick kick is very much a valid option. Not only that, it's a fantastic resource for conservative kills, which allows you to stockpile ammo for more pressing scenarios. When it's taken away from you when the suplex comes in, it feels like losing a useful tool in trade for a more powerful kill confirm. You lose out on a crowd control method, but gain a more powerful melee move, meaning you can more effectively conserve ammo. I'm not even touching on how the environment itself can help you, albeit in niche situations, such as using slopes to make kamikaze Granados kill themselves, using bridges and thinner walkways to topple enemies, or using the traps laid out for you against them. These elements aren't used as frequently, but when available they can function as good ammo savers. Add on that Granados become quicker, alert others to your position, use objects around them, and open doors more effectively than any outbreak zombie, and you have a very engaging combat system, one where you're subconsciously making a lot of decisions. There's a strong understanding here of controlling player behavior with just its standard enemies. Naturally, the player is going to attempt to find the most optimal approach when confronting threats. In most shooters, it's finding cover and waiting for the headshot to present itself. In RE4, I'd say the best response is to attempt to maneuver all enemies after you so that you can pick them off safely, one at a time. That's this game's equivalent of playing whack-a-mole. This works on close-ranged enemies but fails to cover projectile users. This admittedly does work as an effective tactic against shielded enemies in Plagas and only becomes more effective the better your arsenal gets, but the level design definitely helps to pick up the slack here. Again, why I consider the world around the player to be very important. Dropping the ball here would diminish the effort gone into the enemies in Leon. The initial firefight seems daunting, but I'd reckon, I guess I'm a cowboy, it's used as a tutorial because the optimal response can easily work here. As long as you keep on your feet, you can easily group enemies and pick them off. The bullet sponges do little to work against you here because you simply have so much space to work with. Progress on, and you'll find scenarios where enemies wait to ambush you, when you're in a more vulnerable position by virtue of the environment itself mitigating movement options. Forced engagements wisely begin placing you around more obstacles in order to force you closer to the enemy if you wish to hit them. It allows you to move around, but doesn't allow the enemy in your sights if you get too far away. Combined with the synergy the enemies bring, you're consistently making tactical decisions, maneuvering away enemies so that you can deal with the ranged threat first, weeding out ganados for all the plagas, possibly using your surroundings to conserve ammo, grouping up enemies to set up for another attack, weighing your reserves against the space around you to determine the firearm you should be using. Maybe you're just after the key item instead and only wish to respond as necessary to the threat. The decisions you make for the firefight are influenced by all aspects of design. At its outright best, the enemies force you to make a decision that you don't want to, but they've cornered you into an undesirable scenario. They've successfully filled their role and posed a real threat. This is what makes the combat great, and blows my mind when someone plays a low-effort shooter and considers it good. They tend to get part of the formula right, the controls handle well, and it absolutely feels satisfying to shoot at something, but then all other encounters are the same damn thing, and weapons barely make any distinctions. We'll take some hypothetical garbage shooter. Take some like Tomb Raider 2013. The shooting controls are about as mechanically sound as you could want in a third-person shooter. The thing is, Lara is also built to hop around like a batty little monkey, and is incredibly agile. For combat purposes, she has a quick and potent melee weapon only falling off in power if it's not upgraded, or against the game's final variant of Soldier. The bow serves as a mid to long range weapon for stealth killing since it doesn't emit sound, but it's also pretty effective in an active engagement. The pistol serves the exact same purpose since it has a silencer. The rifle is relegated to the mid-range for its lackluster accuracy until it gets a scope, then it just overlaps with the pistol and the bow. The shotgun is really the only one with a defined role. These weapons can serve unique purposes, but near all encounters are kept to the mid to close range down to the very end, meaning all weapons are about as effective as one another, since a headshot's a headshot. As long as you nap them in the head, who cares if it's with the pistol, or the rifle, or the shotgun, or the bow? Why would you care, since ammo for any of these used weapons comes back to you like a traumatized ex-girlfriend, since the game has some closet phobia of ever letting the player run dry on a specific weapon. This is literally the last firefight in the game, and it hasn't elevated itself from a basic design aspect from the moment you are handed a gun. You pick a spot, and you go for the face. One enemy tries to flank, sometimes they have armor or shield. This is the grand total of all the thought that went into the enemy design. Effectively, the person with the gun who may or may not attempt to flank, or the one with better defenses whose role is to get you to move from cover so enemies can attempt to shoot you. All while forgetting that your character is a fucking jungle chimpanzee, and evasion is one of her best strengths. Like, yeah, they got you to move, but this character is really fucking good at moving. Like she was built from the ground up to be really fucking good at moving. Which also helps you easily find more cover if you take too long to stop and advance. It takes a combination of being an incredibly poor shot and a lack of space to lose the fight on normal. The terrain here is also just a new coat of paint on the general firefight. It's the same scenario as the one you were introduced to, and the ones you've played throughout the game. There's objects to get behind cover, your enemies hide, then you hide, until the war of attrition is over. This neglects a sizable portion of your character's abilities. $59.99 please. That's the problem when you get a little too ambitious for your own good. Your character can do all kinds of shit, but the enemies can't effectively cover their options. Because there's only a few fucking types which overlap with one another. Because you were more concerned with telling me some stupid island drama. Or you could flip the switch from normal, presumably what the game was designed around, to hard, which will then have all enemy variants turn into a bullet sponge, increase their damage output, and vastly increase their accuracy. In which case, you're pretty much forced to play all engagements exactly the same, because hard definitely overcorrects for Lara's superior mobility. Leon himself keeps the engagements from feeling cheap because he has a wealth of grounded options. But the enemies in world also account for everything he can do, which isn't much, granted, but it makes combat more engaging. I've only covered ganados too. You still have your chainsaw wielding boys, who I guess are ganados, but they're way more bullet spongy than the standard enemy. They're effectively mini bosses. Contacting with them is a one-hit KO, and when thrown in with a mob, that naturally creates situations of prioritizing targets. Dogs get a buff, and combined with Plagos make for quick damage dealers. This essentially forces careful play because allowing something more agile than yourself to surround you is nearly a death sentence, and their agility also means certain weapon types are more reliable in this instance. Garradors are insane bullet sponges and can potentially one-hit KO you, but they are blind and can be taken advantage of. They also have a weak spot on their backs, enticing you to wait for the optimal attack scenario to conserve ammo, which is again only a problem because the problem of scarcity exists. Combined with mobs, this makes you go about engagements more carefully, since you know every sound you make will attract this difficult enemy best dealt with one-on-one. The minigun users force more traditional whack-a-mole style of gameplay, added on top of more immediate threats which can effectively move you out of cover. This makes your field of engagement smaller than it would be otherwise and creates a situation of prioritizing targets. Novistadors become invisible and can attack from the air, meaning certain weapons in your arsenal are preferred over others since they're quite agile. They don't allow you to mindlessly run around the environment, but they also don't soak up bullets as well as other enemies. Regenerators are probably the most classic Resident Evil enemy type, being slow moving and difficult to kill unless you know exactly where to shoot them. The only way to know exactly where to shoot them is to use a long-range weapon, so to make up for it, you only encounter them in close quarters environments. Each enemy will force the player into a different response pattern, and mixing them up in interesting combinations, as well as varying the terrain, will keep the player engaged making tactical decisions on how to win the fight. This is why it's such a strong third-person shooter. The best response is not the same response, over and over again. It should be a real easy and basic concept, but it's sad how much it isn't. This is a top-down Zelda game. This character's best basic combat response is to swing that sword like it's a dateless Saturday night on a hentai watching spree. It doesn't rely on ammo or magic, he's always got it, it's this definitive tool. So the enemies populating the world take this into consideration. The easiest variants are slow moving and can be attacked at any angle. Then the concept of shields is introduced, requiring more precision from the player. Ranged attackers and quick moving enemies then come into the fold. Then there's aerial enemies which can only be attacked at certain moments when they're on your level. Enemies which are not safe to attack at all times. Enemies which force movement out of you when attacked. Having this variety of types serves a crucial function of forcing a type of response from the player. They simply cannot stand in a corner and swing a sword at all times because the enemies are forcing them to change their approach. When you have this, you can do things like mix them in interesting ways, making the simple action of swinging a sword a highly tactical one. And this happens on a moment-to-moment basis in game. This is why the player gets engaged. Like if you ever argue something stupid, like,
I think that third-person shooters with cover mechanics are as much fun as you make them. Meaning, if you find a corner of a level to hide behind and play a reverse game of whack-a-mole, wherein you're the mole with a submachine gun murdering someone each time you pop up, then I think it's your own fault if you think the combat was boring at the end.
If the enemy doesn't force you to change your response, or forces the same response over and over again, then why would you change your tactics? It doesn't matter that the close quarters enemies approach you. It doesn't matter if the armored enemy approaches you. It doesn't matter if the flankers move in, and it doesn't matter if the shield bro moves in once you got the grenade launcher. The response is the same. Take cover and fire. Repeat until all is dead. You can do things like have a ranged attacker on the ends of the map, keeping the player on their toes while they're assaulted by another threat. Certain enemies can literally force the player to keep you moving lest they want to take damage. Not only that, but smart level design can also mix well with enemies. You can place enemies which are a minor nuisance at best under ordinary circumstances in places that make their properties suddenly deadly. You can ask the player to move somewhere with haste only to have an enemy which can't be attacked at all times stand in their way. Notice how you can achieve difficulty without insanely swapping out enemy stats. This game could have had the biggest budget story with the most diverse cast ever. But if it only had the same 4 enemies in the same type of environments, then it's not worth shit. Fuck this game.
Just up ahead is the village.
I'll go and have a look around.
Yeah, we'll stay and watch that car. Don't want to get any parking tickets.
Still haven't paid any of mine. You think that's why the police keep finding me?
Oh my god. Am I supposed to shoot him?
So you walk into a man's home and you just immediately want to shoot him. The village portion is naturally about getting the player acquainted with the game before prepping a turkey baster for your asshole. This single enemy here is very weak and can go down with a single shot at times. Use the initial check to make sure you can ready and fire your weapon before swarming more enemies at you. Once you put him down, despite the next cutscene, you're perfectly safe in the house until you find and perform your first context-sensitive action. This ensures you know they in fact exist. From here, combat is not mandatory until the first major section, but you're free to play around with the immediate low-level threat.
Oh god. Stop it, get out of here. Go away.
That was a nice little twirl he did.
Oh my god. Oh, what is that guy? He's alive! Stop.
Just shoot him.
I don't have, oh, I do have bullets. Never mind. He does not run. Like, what is wrong with him? No, I didn't miss. Okay, there we go.
This is a very popular game, so it was refreshing to see how exactly new players dealt with things. It was a nice reminder that these choices in design are for a deliberate reason. Experienced players can breeze by this stuff with ease, but first-timers need time to acclimate themselves to combat before asking them to do it in a more stressful situation.
But the real question is, how does one reload this gun?
Well...
Okay, it's gotta be... Is it something this simple? Is that what it is? Combine? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Oh god.
Are you okay?
No! Nope.
I need help.
I
need help.
I am being.
Okay, wait.
I'm being barred from helping you right now. I'm sorry. You cannot combine bullets with anything.
No, I'm not trying to combine them. I don't know. I'm so.
I'm gonna watch this now.
Alright, I'm gonna put over here. Okay, you're saying no.
I'm gonna say no.
You're saying no.
My stomach hurts and I'm making noises because it
Wait,
hurts.
how did I even pick it up? Wait. No. Do I just put them on the gun? What will happen? Am I gonna lose them?
We'll see.
Can I pick them up again if I drop them? Okay, I'm just gonna do it.
Okay.
No! What did I do?
I have a bullet. How do I reload? Oh. How do I reload? How do I reload? I could reload. This is gonna piss me off. Oh, I have a knife? Oh my god!
On their way to the first major encounter, there's a few things the player can interact with. The big ones being the dog you can rescue for the giant fight later, the crows the players can shoot, wire traps, and item boxes. Depending on how they play out this section, the following one can be a little easier or harder thanks to the invisible mechanic of the game's dynamic difficulty referred to as rank. The more the player gets hit by attacks, the more they miss, or if they manage to actually die, the rank stat will decrease, subtly affecting the game's difficulty under the hood. If the player's rank is low, the damage you deal out increases, the damage you take decreases, the number of total enemies can drop, the number of enemies can become slower to approach and attack, they become less likely to dodge, and some have their health altered. Proper documentation on these effects is limited, but the effects don't seem to be too drastic or play a role in the game's professional mode where the rank is set at a more difficult constant. At least, that's what I gather based on this one stat. What it attempts is fine-tuning the balance of difficulty without making it apparent to the player that any sort of pity is being taken on them. The game ups the ante if the player is breezing by the current challenge and also pumps the brakes if a certain part begins to overwhelm them. Whether that's inherently a good thing will be dependent on the person's desire for a consistent challenge they can overcome. But for the most part, this stat will remain invisible to them throughout their entire playthrough, so everyone will feel equally as accomplished for overcoming an obstacle, even if they did require a little help.
Stuck her man behind the tree. Where the fuck did you get binoculars from? Where'd you pull it out? Oh, that's not it. Oh, that's too. Oh, that's a nice chicken.
The village opener is an introduction to the frantic firefights the player will find themselves in frequently. They'll be tasked with managing a substantially higher amount of enemies as well as deal with them working in tandem with one another. What makes the task easier than it appears to newcomers is the vast amount of space they have to work with. Unless they box themselves in by heading for one of the 3 big gates or the one-way shacks towards the west exit, the village is designed with a lot of ways to loop yourself around, both outside and inside of buildings. Since there'll usually always be a place to run away, the player is unlikely to find themselves overwhelmed despite their initial reactions.
You know what? I'm going straight to this gate. Goodbye. It won't open. It must be barred from the other side. I guess that'd be too convenient if I could just escape. Oh, God. Yep. Yep.
Here you go.
Yep. Just gonna walk away calmly.
Once the introduction has been cleared, the game returns to optional combat scenarios. The only goal of the player is to move ahead to the shack, so in order to slow them down, the Blue Medallion Challenge encourages them to look around for fairly small-sized collectibles. The tangible rewards doesn't hurt either. This will stop completionists from simply running past everything, but the enemies themselves seem to do a good job at causing the new player to willingly engage. On your way, you'll encounter the first of many QuickTime events, which this game helped to popularize in the medium. Of the game's mechanics, this is the one I find has aged the poorest. Reviewers ate this shit up back in the day. Little did they know this would go on to create mindless QTE inserts for future titles.
The game is so action-packed that even some of the seemingly non-interactive cinematic cutscenes require fast reflexes on your part, so don't you dare put down the controller.
The game is a lot more action-oriented. You even have to watch cutscenes with the controller in a tight grip, because you never know when you might need to participate in the story by pressing a random combination of buttons.
Many times you'll be asked to input button commands in a split second, or face the consequences. In fact, you can't even relax during the cutscenes.
Conceptually, I understand them. They're an attempt to gamify cutscenes, and this was one of the many new ideas the game was tossing out. At its most harmless, it's asking you to hit a combination to continue playing. Slightly more harmful is asking you to mash as fast as you can, becoming harder with certain versions, modifying the frame rate.
I was hitting X.
At its worst failing, one of these forces you to watch the same long cutscene over and over again, should you fail. If your story is compelling enough and implemented well, players will seek it out. Keeping them on the nose by fear of having to rewatch a sequence in case they need to hit some buttons is not the way to go about it. The Krauser fight is the game's worst offense, and the one I find that people wish they could maneuver around when replaying the game. Even if the story engages people and they enjoy the stuff first time around, Resident Evil, as always, is a game meant for replays. There's plenty of incentive to do it all again. You only build resentment by forcing players to watch certain scenes repeatedly. Sometimes the game is smart about this and allows you to skip directly to the button pushing part, effectively still allowing you to skip the cutscene. But when it doesn't, and you're making your second or third pass through, is where you'll find the inherent flaw with the cutscene QTEs. They've got nothing to do with the game's primary mechanics, they're just an attempt to gamify a passive element because heaven forbid the game have less cutscenes. Compared to everything around it, I consider the QTEs Resident Evil 4's biggest blunder. Not just in its own game, but in all the other games it influenced because it was successful. But hey, if not you, then someone else would've. As far as their implementation, they're spaced out apart from each other far enough to where it isn't overbearing. You get a fair bit of gameplay before this boulder, then a fair bit more before the next one, and so on. It's not the worst thing by any means, but that's about as positive as I can describe them. Not the worst thing. Making it to the canyon introduces one of our last major elements to the game. The Traveling Merchant allows the game a convenient means of implementing RPG elements, which in turn gives value to other design aspects. As you progress along, the enemy variants will naturally become stronger by virtue of higher base HP. You're allowed to pick and choose what weapon types you upgrade for future engagements, adding just a little bit of personalization to your run. You'll probably use all the same weapons the person next to you does, but your combat style can vary a little based on what guns you prioritize for upgrade. Because weapon upgrades are valuable to combat, which is a very common occurrence, this naturally gives value to the world's in-game currency, and by extension, the secrets hidden in the world, since they have high monetary value. And weapon upgrades are acquired with money. When the sell function is discovered, the players will find out just how valuable the random trinkets they have in their collection are, and be compelled to keep an eye out for them since this can translate to weapon upgrades sooner rather than later. You're probably only going to max out 1 or 2 guns to the fullest on your first go, even with the treasures. These RPG elements not only allow the player to customize their style of play, but make players who would otherwise speed through environments slow down since there's always a potential to find a valuable, tangible secret. The key here is scarcity is still in full effect. Buying a gun will often prevent an upgrade and vice versa. Money can be drained for health resources if you perform too poorly, and some firearms have attachments which will also cost financial resources. You're not just gonna max out everything you find by playing casually. You have to decide what's important to you and invest in that asset. This could have easily been a crappy, tacked-on component, but these elements are actually fairly well thought out. The Wii version invalidates some of the gun attachments by virtue of how the game is controlled, but other than that, the merchant adds a lot to the game while giving some tangible value to the other elements. As newer guns and more inventory potential are introduced, the incentive to explore thoroughly only increases. I neglected to mention the attaché case when talking about Leon's base changes, so I guess now's a good time. As opposed to the finite 8 to 10 slots you've been given in the past, the new inventory system makes the character's item pool make a whole lot more sense. No longer does a can of spray occupy the same space as a shotgun. Now you can carry as many things as you can fit into a finite space, and with good organization, that's more than you'd ever be able to carry in the games prior. Like most other things, this space can be upgraded with the merchant, further buffing your combative abilities by increasing your weapon pool, health pool, and ammunition pool. The system is nearly perfect, save for the amount of time the player needs to call it during combat, breaking up the flow of gameplay. If there was a way to assign weapons and health to a quick select menu, the player would never have to pause mid-combat to change weapons or restore health. All engagements could function seamlessly. As it is now, this system is actually a pretty big blemish on an otherwise very polished game. It gets a lot right, but it's very slow to interact with when compared to the titles that get to learn from it. For the slower paced titles, the menu usage didn't really mess with the pacing that much, as you usually stuck to your firearm and only opened the menu for puzzles. You would never actively switch from a handgun to a shotgun, back to a handgun, to a grenade, to a different type of grenade, to a machine gun, back to the handgun in the span of one fight. Maybe a boss, but not common enemies. The combat scenarios here demand more weapon flipping, but the system for swapping will consistently break the flow of the game. Honestly, having this style of item holding with the modern style of switching would make the most sense, but it's yet to be seen. The way it lets you carry items is top tier, but its effect on combat is a negative. I can't say breaking the flow to consistently enter the pause menu is a good thing. As mentioned before, the Valley section is an optional combat segment in disguise. The aggressiveness of the enemies will prompt the player to fight, but all they need to do here is collect 2 tablets for their exit. There are spots where the players can one-shot enemies, causing them to fall, and spots where to post up. It's a more restrictive version of the village. There's less room to just maneuver around enemies, so the player needs to be a bit more intelligent here. The basing afterwards will turn more progression-based. Leon just needs to push on ahead to the church where Ashley is. The engagements won't be as bombastic as the canyon or initial village. Along the way is plenty of breathing room to find treasure, keep up with their medallion hunt, and continue to develop their playstyle. Not much really changes about the pacing until the player hits their first boss encounter at the lake. The fight entirely abandons the mechanics the player has been getting familiar with, and instead has them on a boat checking spears like a spear checker does. I can't really see the train of thought for this encounter, but it's harmless enough. No way to cheese it, you just need some basic driving skills to avoid getting thrown into the water so the fight can proceed as fast as it can. Fuck, I need to take a goddamn breather. Next up is the introduction of the Plagas type Ganado, increasing the general combat difficulty even more. From here, how long it takes the player to realize how godly flash grenades are is anyone's guess. For those that never discover the trick, the Plagas will turn basic enemies into more aggressive bullet sponges. Not as durable as any mini-boss, but they will require a little extra attention and consistently drain the player's ammo reserves. Before making it to the church, Leon will have to take on another boss, this one fought by conventional means. As long as the player can make use of the wide open space, they shouldn't have a problem here, especially true if they save the dog from earlier on. It's a solidly executed fight with some good design touches such as the destructible environment around Leon, but I'd wager it's here to drain your ammo reserves a little since the last boss didn't require any of your own ammo, and you could simply avoid all encounters up until this point. Prior to your end goal, the dog-type Plagas are introduced, making themselves known as a potential threat. Then, once inside the church, one last simple puzzle stands in the way of Leon's main objective.
I'm not good at puzzles. My mom fucking should have swallowed me.
What?
Yeah, I shouldn't be born.
Well, good night. This brings us to the next biggest shift of Resident Evil 4's design, the Escort portions.
Fuck my life.
Instead of having Leon find Ashley in the end of the game to wrap things up, we actually managed to be good at our job and find her almost immediately. She's introduced after the players had time to get comfortable with movement and their weapons. They've gotten their feet wet with some of the basic and not so basic altercations, so the game once again decides to change the rules. Ashley's inclusion introduces another layer of management, as now they have another body to look after, another human-sized tool for puzzle solving, as well as another potential dump for certain stat upgrades. At this point in human history, these types of missions have mainly been more missed than hit, so hearing RE4 had a sizable escort portion wasn't the most comfortable thing to learn. Not only that, but Ashley isn't just an escort section, she's an integral game mechanic. Despite what others have to say, I'd argue Ashley is fairly well implemented. She gives the combat another layer of depth since the player has to be cognizant of her existence. If Ashley is taken by the enemy through any room exit where the game must load, the mission is an automatic fail. The spaces where you have to manage this are also carefully balanced. Early on, you're given spots where Ashley can be safely dumped and ignored to play the game as normal. This plants the idea in your head to simply leave Ashley behind in safer locations before engaging mobs of enemies. When you can no longer dump her in a bin, you then have to find spots to leave her so stage hazards and enemies cannot readily attack her. However, you'll find the enemy spawns usually account for commonly perceived safe spaces. So when she is grabbed by an enemy, you have to play on a timer, which in turn may force you to use a resource you may not want to. Or play a little more recklessly to keep her out of harm's way. The nature of how the fail state works also discourages leaving her at the beginning of most rooms since a single spawn can spell your loss. Not to mention, she can also be damaged by your own bullets. Ashley's health will then in turn punish your health reserves if you're forced to heal her often. The pinnacle of combat difficulty with Ashley comes from when you're trapped in a space with her and must actively defend her from what would otherwise be common threats. Under normal circumstances, the player wouldn't find difficulty for this routine set of basic enemies, but forcing Ashley to be an active part of the engagement completely changes how you have to play it. This is only done once, and the room is cited as one of the game's most infamously challenging ones. There's a logical escalation from being able to throw her out of the picture entirely, to having to keep an eye on the space you leave her, to having to actively defend her. Perhaps this room's challenge is why they usually don't opt to force the player in this type of scenario. Thankfully, the game wisely recognizes when to remove Ashley entirely. You go through this, you take her, then they take her, then you take her, then they take her. She dips in and out of the game. The reason being that certain scenarios simply cannot be balanced correctly if you're forced to maintain watch over Ashley. And if the situation does arise that it would be a bit of a major chore with Ashley, then the game finds a way to stow her away. They never just allow a blatantly bullshit scenario to occur when Ashley is under your watch. The more action-packed stuff coincidentally only happens when Leon is far, far away from her. Her role as the escorted is at its best when you have some wiggle room, when you're doing a little more on the exploration side. Smaller enemy counts can make a viable threat since they have the option to threaten Ashley over you. She also has the ancillary function of being a puzzle-solving tool, lending her well to these comparatively quieter moments. And when you're asked to split up for a puzzle, you know some shit's about to go down. Escort missions definitely just don't sit right with some people regardless, but on the whole, Ashley is fairly unobtrusive. I'd actually argue her inclusion adds to the gameplay in meaningful ways, serving as a functional management and puzzle-solving tool. Out of the game's 6 chapters, which is broken up into 19 subsections, Ashley isn't introduced until the second one. From there, only chapters 2-2, 2-3, 3-1, 3-4, 4-1, 5-2, 5-4, and 6 include her. 8 subsections. But only really 6 have her in any meaningful way. The last two are her showing up in the end to be cured of a disease, and her being told to stand aside for the final boss. When she is included, the pacing of the game tends to slow down, so as not to make her a nuisance and instead makes her an asset to be managed like anything else. As far as escort scenarios go, I'd cite Ashley as one of the best examples. The enemies have a reason to not kill her and only attempt to apprehend her. She's a prioritized target, and this behavior from the enemy forces certain actions out of you, which is what a good enemy does. She's got some functionality for puzzles, and the game knows when to and when to not include her. Honestly, I don't think I've seen it done better. Not that I have a lot to go off of, but she's a very solid inclusion for a game filled with ideas out the wazoo. When you finally bum your way through the farm, Nazi Zombies beta mode initiates. On first runs without any of the swag guns and higher ammo reserves, this is a hell of a spike in difficulty. Not much to say about it. Cramped space, high enemy count, equals a hell of a time for the player. Having the knowledge that flash grenades are Jesus' chosen weapon will greatly ease the pain if you have them on deck. If not, the enemies will drop ammo, forcing you to scavenge and fight around. Surviving will net you a simple choice to make. Ignore the comment Lewis made and take Tanisha home, or stay at the party and keep it real. Wu-Tang! By going either left or right. One leading you to double chainsaws and an enemy horde, the other to a giant, naked man. The giant's path is easily the more painless of the two, since you're not even required to kill him. You just need to grab a key and hit the final door. What makes it challenging is forcing Ashley into the fight, whereas the other path is much longer, but allows you to safely discard her. By virtue of Ashley existing, this dilemma probably had some players reconsider their route, since she is an immediate danger here. And coming off the cabin segment, you're probably not well stocked on ammo. Since new players do not know they can simply run past this guy, they can assume they must kill him to pass by. Little stuff like this is why I think Ashley's inclusion is a net positive. She does force some decision making from the player. Some people who would have gone through this route probably swapped because they were taking Ashley into consideration. The final thing to do to end the village segment is beat this gate, so we have to beat one last boss. Progression to him throws out the unique scenario of a lift, which isn't repeated upon return, and you're allowed one last stop at the merchant before your confrontation. This is the second conventional fight, although more vertical space is thrown in for you to maneuver around. Dying here will force you to reduce some quick time events, and given the man's difficulty, I'd say it's a very high possibility for first timers who didn't buy the rocket launcher. He throws out attacks that can be dodged with context sensitive actions, has good telegraphing which allows you to evade damage consistently once you figure him out, and he comes in two variations which forces you to carefully aim your shots. He's a good test of what mechanics you've been frequenting thus far, and a good climax to the village section. Jesus fuck me Christ, we're just now getting to the castle. And my knees are starting to hurt. But I better just deal with it because this is just the best fucking segment in the entire game. Everything about this castle. It's probably not true, so I'm going to play it safe and say most things about this castle. It's fucking divine.
It's a little early to be that deep in the bottle, Leon.
Well, look who it is. The BSAA's golden boy and Dr. High Hopes. The hell do you want?
Let's talk about Los Illuminados. Remember the type of BOWs they were using?
That's so long ago, I don't remember.
Louis!
Another bottle here.
The initial section tasks you a simple puzzle to open a large gate, as well as asking you to keep Ashley safe in a more combat-heavy environment. There's nowhere to dump her off this time, so you need to pick your spots carefully. You have to navigate the enemies, a giant catapult launching fireballs at your face, and get the cannon in place to shoot down the gate. Whether or not this is a peaceful action is up to how many of the catapults you take out. Looking back on this, there's actually not too many enemies. It's more or less just swapping the terrain and Ashley's inclusion that ramps up the difficulty here. This first indoor portion is a more claustrophobic combat section with Ashley by your side. Because of the layout, it's easy to maneuver enemies in line and keep her out of the way. Guarding her hasn't become a devastating prospect yet. If you're some kind of god at maneuvering, you can save your ammo since all you have to do is just swap swords around on display to open your way forward. So if you're willing to allow Ashley to get captured for a quick moment, you can blue skidoo your way through. I've never had to do that type of guerrilla style play for this section, but I like that the game has to leave options to account for the possibility that the player might be out of ammo. This is why I think firefights generally just use enemies as a block in front of a puzzle, even towards the end of the game. Though enemy drop rates are sure to keep your reserves at least on low. Once you get into the main halls, you're finally free to ditch Ashley for the introduction of a mini-boss. His space is designed to teach you about his strengths and weaknesses. The boy is quick, hits hard, but he's blind. Once you learn to take advantage of this, it's fine, but he will be popping up later with other enemies included, so you're gonna have to learn how to manage your play around him. From what I can tell, he doesn't react to Leon's walking state, so as long as you don't run, whatever it takes to move away as fast as possible is a valid option. Following is that one room, probably the peak difficulty of combat with Ashley. The enemies have a lot of ways to flank, and they come in higher numbers. The lay of the land would make tackling this area solo near trivial, since giving Leon a lot of movement space is generally a good asset for him. But because Ashley cannot safely be left anywhere, she's pretty much tied to yourself, and the asset of space is turned into a double-edged sword. Plenty of space to move, but many opportunities for Ashley to get caught. Even leaving her in the room downstairs isn't a safe bet since enemies spawn into that room from the vents. The shielded enemy's role of stalling gets a buff here because there's usually a way to approach you from behind, so standing still isn't a good option. The best one is to keep moving and schmoving, so the shield boys play the role well here. Following the bukkake is a little shooting minigame you can play for caps. Trivial on Wii, but a decent challenge for a standard controller. We ditched the girl, so the game can now throw out some more menacing foes our way without it feeling cheap. This section is the same basic Resident Evil premise of working a puzzle in an area to progress, but we got the twist of invisible enemies which keeps it tense. Gotta admire how hard the game's trying to keep it fresh. For Generation 6, this many areas and this many unique assets to one title is pretty not common. The only thing distinguishing it from its AAA contemporaries is the fact that this thing was made for a 480p console. But for this area, the only thing elevating the basic obstacle is the enemies and the resulting atmosphere. Makes a straightforward, simple task stand out. Here we get presented with one of those little moments I like about this game. When a batch of something or other is standing ahead and you're rewarded for managing to kill them all. When you're caught in one of these without a flash grenade, it's a test of using your resources effectively. You're not likely to net all the kills with only basic firearms, so you're probably better off going for the important looking one with the most expensive treasure. The following engagement has you chasing one of the mooks with a key attached to him. All you have to do is kill him by any means to end the engagement, so this leaves you with some freedom on how you want to handle things. Fight your way through, run through, or kill as necessary. You're presented a few opportunities to catch him just before he hits his destination, so naturally stall enemies get their chance to shine here. I like the way that just simply changing your task from the simple kill everything and everyone can bring out the different strengths of certain enemies. I don't think they took advantage of this scenario enough and that there's only one shield enemy to dodge, and placing them in some more spots would make for more of a challenge. If you can catch this guy before he makes it through the last door, you end the engagement fairly painlessly. Failing to do so results in a big gun staring you down the face and a unique engagement. Concluding leads to a harder version of the matching puzzles back in the village. It's framed like a classic RE puzzle, but it's self-contained here like all the others. You ascertain the solution from the message given, and rotate the pictures where they need to be. Getting here is the first time Leon gets to have a more basic firefight on his own without having to babysit Ashley. Though per usual, there is a goal to work towards, so rooting everything isn't necessary. The more confined spaces will prompt you to fight naturally, but as long as you can pick up the goat ornament for your fancy mural, you can leave. The frantic fights will tone down for a moment as you travel ahead to the next scenario with some opportunities for picking up treasure. The following segment is the maze, which I've already spoke about. It's the same setup as the valley in a new coat of paint and a different type of threat. Surprise, surprise, simply changing the terrain and enemy type creates a completely different scenario with its own unique challenge. The aggressive dogs mesh well with having your vision obscured, so the shotgun or other weapons capable of spreading large hitboxes become preferred.
Put your hands where I can see them.
Sorry, but following a lady's lead just isn't my style.
Totally patriarchal.
Put them up now.
Dr. High Hopes, the hell do you want?
Following the maze is probably the most roided up version of the firefight setup of this game. Like normal, you're fronted a scenario with enemies and a goal of some kind. The game then stipulates as long as you can hit this goal, kill as many or as little things as you want. Only this time the goal is like 2 feet away from you and you're trapped in a box. Here's the lock, you're the key. If you're up to it, it's one of the hardest firefights the game has to offer, trapping you in with projectile users and a mini-boss. If you aren't up to it, you can simply leave given you can break the lock and move quickly. This is the same setup that the game has been presenting all the way through, and it's still finding new ways to paint it up that make it feel fresh. It's a marvel at how many different scenarios this game crafts with the basic third-person shooter mechanics. And it does it all without having everything around you blow up or break down. Just good old-fashioned reliance on the game's bread and butter. The following room has the same concept as kill as much as you need to, so long as you can extend the bridge and leave the room. What entices you to stay are the potential rewards laid about, but as always, if you're slippery enough, you can make away with everything while evading most everything. You know, this is probably why fans of the old games and the new ones like RE4. Speedrunning the old games was essentially working through puzzles and fighting when necessary, and this one conforms to that mold, only it manages to throw out new idea after new idea, so it feels unlike any other third-person shooter you've likely played. The enemies also do fine enough slowing things down, so you simply don't run by everything either. It's just nice to see a game that expends effort on making combat worth it. Something you want to do because it makes sense to do, or because there's a tangible reward. Not because you were forced to keep shooting until the enemies stopped. Next section, you have to keep shooting until the enemies stop, but framed under the scenario of keeping Ashley out of their dirty little mitts. They don't opt to do this a lot, because there's always a chance the player can just completely run out of ammo. There's vases around here which can drop what the player needs to clear this section, but despite this, certain guns are definitely better for the job. Ashley is still vulnerable to attack, so you have to make sure not to hit her. This, however, becomes a joke if Ashley is wearing the suit of armor. These guys seem to have comparatively low health, so it's not that bad. The game's just doing its own thing of throwing out ideas. The Ashley section is probably the most puzzle heavy in the game. There's actually a proper space to work in with doors to unlock. It pales in comparison to anything seen prior, but the guns are taken away, the enemies come out to play, and you're forced to work through it with nothing but a can of beans and a pocket full of greens. This is as classic Resident Evil as the game will get. Properly housing the hardest puzzle the game's going to throw at you. I'm pretty sure these night things were left over from a different cycle of development for the game, so it's cool that they found a way to not let it go to waste. Reuniting with our burden, the game gets out a different paintbrush and goes to town. It's the same thing as before, but the twist of giant fireballs shooting dragon statues is what sells it. It really does not take much to keep it fresh. It seems menacing, but this segment is more of a breather due to the drastic drop in enemies. Here we've got some free reign to navigate the castle. The biggest reward for doing so is a free broken butterfly if you can recall to go back to the maze before pushing on ahead. But then we just keep the castle antics coming.
Great. More of them.
To go on ahead, you need 2 cuffs for this one door. They're placed behind separate challenge areas, so this part's pretty classic RE. One puts you in a room of knights, and you have to be like retarded to bring Ashley here. This is where that flash grenade strat starts to become money. Ashley gets puzzle use, then the midget attempts to kill you with some kind of Scooby-Doo contraption. You naturally escape into another supervillain attempt to kill you. Technically this would kill Ashley, which they definitely don't want to do at this point. Doing this nets you the other cup, so you're ready to go. I should have probably spoke through this, but I can only suck this game's dick so much before running out of breath. As you can see, the castle is far from done delivering the goods. You've now got a clock tower to work in, clearing up the cogs for its functionality. The enemies here do a good job of blocking you from simply running by them, so some more tactical play is required for progression into the next tower over. I wonder where exactly Leon's going, because that thing could have taken Ashley like literally anywhere. It could have taken her back to the village, but I guess we'll just go this way. It'll work out, probably. You ever see Wolverine 2? That's roughly what happens. The fight here is a mandatory one. You've got some more space to work with, but here you've got 2 big threats in the way, laced with some more run-of-the-mill mooks. The mooks keep you from easily abusing the weakness of the blind enemies, and the blind enemies keep you from easily rooting out the mooks. These enemies work well in tandem with one another. The space also provides some unique noise-making assets to take advantage of. It's only a total of 6 enemies, but it's one of the game's more challenging engagements.
Ashley.
Dr. High Hopes.
Luckily for us, the place we went to was where Ashley was. We don't manage to catch her, but we still get to be sassy. What follows is one of the game's more memorable segments, and yet another shining example of less being more. There's build up for a single menacing enemy, while you figure out how to escape from the pits. The forced engagement prior probably dipped into your reserves, so it's you with limited ammo versus a very tough enemy. If you think you're cheesing out this one with a rocket, you're shit out of luck. The space leaves unique assets to help you deal with them, and if you run out of resources to fight and can't hack the kill with a knife, then you have to last until the elevator arrives to pick you up, which takes a fair bit of time. The elevator will arrive quicker if you manage to kill him, but it's good that the option for evasion still exists for first timers. They definitely won't be forgetting this encounter anytime soon. So I guess that one guy we knew from that one time is back. Why is he here? Who the fuck knows, but it's good that we had that other game to establish him, otherwise it might seem like they're fabricating a character who Leon knows out of the blue. We are still in the castle, and this thing is just still given and given. My lord, I might have to pick this up again tomorrow. The mine segment keeps on with the game's mantra of optional combat, forcing your hand with good design. Not much going on here that you haven't dealt with previously, just a fresh coat of paint with different objects of interest. A lot here can dip into your ammo reserves, so hopefully you save some for the 2 big boys you gotta put down. They leave a way to insta-cheese one or both of them since the kill here is required, but per usual, they leave you with some combat options in case you fail to net the kill in this manner. You got the cryptic message, now you need to ascertain the solution with those pesky flying enemies. They don't take much to kill, but they approach faster than the human enemies. As long as you're patient, you can clear the room of them. I mean, you can try and run, but the enemy's ability to fly definitely makes that a less enticing proposition. Pressing onwards, we get a brief stint in the castle yard before heading back underground. Presumably, we're still pursuing Ashley, but who cares, we're having a good time. Firefight here is the same premise, but a different coat of paint. Also, there's bear traps the enemy can't trigger themselves to slow down movement. A severe threat with the chainsaw enemies, common mooks to play stall for the chainsaw enemy, and structures to keep your movement options limited. The goal is the key inside the clay structure so you can move on. First time through, I didn't really notice how many opportunities I had to just skate by if I could. I always attempted to clear the room. The design here is definitely more oriented towards stalling movement. Following is the first repeat of an idea with the Scooby-Doo roof trap. Same solution, but this time there's enemies to draw attention to the ground and more points to shoot. The game's going to keep mixing things up, but it's saying something that it took this long for them to retread the exact same idea in the same format. The train is a survival segment with some aiming skill checks. If you can manage to hit targets before they can jump on the train, then you're in for a painless ride. Poor play punishes you by placing threats right next to you in a confined space, the most threatening being a chainsaw man. It kinda feels like they have a comparatively smaller health pool than standard enemies to compensate for the space, but honestly just allowing you to remove them entirely for playing well is compensation enough for the restrictive movement. You are starting some real bad habits. Following is a segment to reactivate platforms instead of just swimming. The space here is more vertical, which changes up how you can approach enemies, or changes up how you can keep them at bay. It's the same carrot on a stick. Get to the designated points and you can carry on. The climax is more key dangling action. Just starting some real bad habits. I'd say the chase is framed this way just to make running away more of a spectacle without it turning into a Crash Bandicoot or Brave Fencer Musashi.
That's not the end of me!
Since the only thing your character can really do is just move and run in terms of movement. So here the QTE makes a fix of the character's limited movement options for this specific scene. So that kinda makes sense, but this type of thought is definitely not applied to this stuff often. We've now got to chase Napoleon up the tower, so we ascend with a mix of some basic movement obstacles spliced with some enemies. The nature of how the center lift works forces you to fight off certain enemies, but besides this, everything continues to remain optional. The forced encounters here feel like a way to keep the long ride up the elevator from simply being a long wait. They splice some projectile users with more common unshielded close range types to keep you from posting in a corner and just casually winning the fight. A good eye will allow you to pick off the ranged attackers earlier for an easier time with more immediate threats. If you always wait until the elevator stalls out, it could result in your funeral. Even for this mundane shit, there's some thought put into which enemies have to work together. You know, it's been a while since we've fought a proper boss. Not much to say about this one besides the good presentation. He's got a pattern of attack, and you've got a pattern to work through in order to expose his weak point. He keeps about the same level of aggression for the whole fight, it's just a way to cap off the castle.
Need a ride, handsome?
Isn't that like sexual harassment these days or something? I guess I looked at her wrong or something.
Got some business to take care of. See you later.
Women.
Maybe that's why he became an alcoholic.
Totally patriarchal.
Sadler, you're small time.
Yes, it seems that way.
Sadler, why don't you give up and let Ashley go home?
Yes.
One more section, Leon. We're almost there. We've scrubbed through the big cheese, we've killed the midget, now we're fixing to kill the big man himself. The mission's still to save Ashley, but the story's trying to give us some face time with the final boss before we shoot him with the rocket. Before arriving to our first conflict, we find this henchman carrying off Ashley, which is a bit strange because she should be long gone by this point. The bully on already shipped her off by the time you reach him. Then you have to kill him, which probably consumes some time. Then you have to make the exact same trip as Ashley had to the island, yet she's just stowed away at the first spot you approach. Are you trying to bait me? Because my guy just kind of runs forward, regardless of whether or not he knows Ashley's location. And it seems to be working out for him. Then again, I exist in this universe. So beginning our island run is a new minigun enemy. He's the most effective long-ranged attacker in the game. He just puts out a high amount of damage, but he's slow to make his turns. This pretty much forces you to navigate cover to close the gap if you need to. If you're not keen on that, this is a standard cover-based shooting as the game will become. Despite the shifting gameplay that the enemy forces, you can still just opt to progress forward if you're capable of activating the puzzle without getting shot to death. Nothing's changed about the design philosophy here, it's just an enemy swap that likely forces you to slow down. This opener follows with a more routine progression section as the game has been doing since the beginning. Some enemies will try their guerrilla tactics, but your encounters are going to be smaller clumps spread throughout. These are the portions where you just need to keep your eye out for treasure and search everything to maximize profit before proceeding. The spaces here are more confined than the castle. A lot more hallway type setups, making it easier for you to become surrounded, which naturally increases the difficulty, since Leon's best response to common threats is to just hit and run if need be. The areas here in general are going to restrict his movement options, so to make up for it, smart use of weapons will have to come into play. Sure, okay, makes sense. Anyway, the indoor environments here begin to throw more heavily armored close-ranged attackers. The shotgun is highly effective for spacing them out for your better damage dealers. Almost a little too effective since it outright knocks them to the ground. They were definitely going for a hard-to-kill threat in a small space that hits you hard. The balance here is supposed to be that they can't attack from a distance, but since you can just outright shove them to the ground like a common playground bully, you're pretty much free to just run by them. The only thing they have going for them is that new players have to figure out what to do in this space, which forces them to stick around longer than they would naturally want to, which will drain their ammo reserves. Once you know what to do, avoiding them is as simple as a buckshot. Again, this stuff is simple. It's just asking you to kill enemies in a timed window from a distance, but the way they frequently space this stuff out is pretty admirable. They're getting a lot of mileage from very simplistic mechanics by doing simple things like this. Changing the world around you to make these mini challenges, throwing in a new enemy type, these two variables are pretty much all they're tweaking, and they're just fucking killing it. Pretty much shames every game with more complex mechanics that can't seem to break away from one formula. Proceeding ahead, a simple RE puzzle will kick off our bit with the Regenerators. It's got the classic Resident Evil setup down to a T. Confined space that you gradually open up with keys, that's there. One-off puzzles, check. Confined spaces limiting your movement around the enemy, present. Tough to kill threats that put stress on your general traversal of an otherwise simple area, yup. Again, if the player has some nerves and a shotgun, the weapon can effectively just shove the thing out of the way. But thankfully, the ammo cost of doing that is higher than the armored enemies. Unfortunately for these guys, the shotgun has spread damage, so it's likely to hit its weak point. When the player has no understanding of how the enemies work, they could very well conclude these things are just invincible. The rifle scope is what tells them that they do in fact have a weakness, since they smartly present a situation where taking the scope results in a regenerator spawning in the room with you. It's common for the thing you pick up to have immediate use, so you'll be tempted to try it out on the enemy. But all it takes is one or more instance of reason to say, well, I don't know where the freaking weak point is, and the shotgun pretty much just hits them anywhere. Better just use a shotgun. And then you win for as long as you have shotgun ammo. But since you likely don't want to be wasting all your reserves, you'll probably just end up using the scope, especially the first time through when you're still learning to navigate the space. Just want to point out again that all they did here was change up the world around you with some conventional locked doors and throw in a new enemy type. Quite literally all you have to do to get a unique game segment that stands out. Well, it's a weird idea, but hey, they're trying. I respect it. The only thing I don't like about it is that it implies the shaft is death, but you need to escape down it later. But Ada's letter does tell you it's an escape route, and a cutscene triggers the escape, so it's not a big issue. A slightly more claustrophobic firefight climaxes with a stronger form of Regenerator, one that's pokey. They put in some legwork to build up dread before the fight, and because it holds a key, it's the one Regenerator you're required to kill. If you haven't already learned how to dispatch the enemy, then the moment's even more intense for the newcomer. There's plenty of space to move around and loop, so as long as Leon has ammo, he's not sweating this encounter.
Leon!
You okay? Come on, let's get out of here.
He said, for the 30th time.
Looks like this is it.
Ugh, it stinks.
Sure does.
No way, Leon.
Way.
You know my favorite thing ever, the coveted block puzzle. The way it's structured, you're just tasked to defend Ashley as a difficult enemy occupies a small space. There's not a lot of room to maneuver here. I guess the designers felt keeping Ashley out in the open for this would be a bit too cheap, so she has provided a proper hiding space. Both characters are required to move the block, and it takes a while for them to get it into position for them to escape. So if the player is willing, they can attempt to run past the Regenerators. Escaping ramps up the progression combat since the enclosed spaces now include Ashley, and she has no proper space to hide away. But again, because the space is enclosed and the shotgun provides spread and knockback, it can greatly ease the stress of these sections. To carry on, one of you two has to rotate a crank to bulldoze a wall, so what this becomes is a defend Ashley section. Keep enemies off her back, and eventually the wall will collapse. It's faster for the player to do it, but this leaves Ashley vulnerable to enemies, so unless you just want to kill everything, the quickest way is to just have Ashley do it. Another small Regenerator section follows your escape. It's just Ashley's inclusion that makes a slight twist on it since you're asked to split up. Besides that, there's nothing you haven't seen before. Following is that segment where Ashley drives the heavy machinery. It's a different coat of paint for the minecart section in the castle, so it isn't something you haven't seen. It's just been a good while since the idea was last repeated. Despite being repeated, it has its own twist on the formula with the trucks you have to fend off and one bit where you have to head out of the car and hit some switches to keep it going while defending Ashley. So it's not just a straight copy-paste. Far from it. So where does success land you? Ashley's captured! Oh no, what a shock. But it's not that she was captured, she just more or less believes you. The mind control thing from the Plagas is kind of a big deal story-wise, but it has no bearing on the gameplay. I would say maybe they should have tried something out, but I can't really say a game that's trying this hard isn't giving it any thought. They probably just couldn't find any meaningful way to include the parasite in gameplay, so instead of bogging down good mechanics with some contrived shit, they just axed it and left it to the story only, which is definitely the right call. Anyway, we're gonna fight Krauser soon, so he starts getting more face time. The progression to him isn't anything special. It's a calming section for poking and prodding around for treasures and trinkets, nothing more, nothing less. The actual encounter, as I've already stated, is the worst QTE in the game. It's a cutscene where the two knife fight and talk. Nothing to do with the core mechanics, I'm just hitting the correct sequence of buttons to continue the conversation, unless I want to watch the entire thing all over again. I know why they did. This room is just odd. Okay. The boss encounter here has a mix of both puzzle and standard firefight. You'll first be trapped in a maze of them where you're tasked with releasing some switches before proceeding to the next segment. Once escaped, it's just rooty tooty point and shooty. Personally, I'm not a fan of it for replays, but I can't really levy any objective criticism to it. Again, it's just changing your environment and throwing in a new enemy for something entirely new, all while relying completely on the core mechanics. It's cinematic, it's tense, bombastic, all without some over-the-top nonsense. I respect it. The QTEs are used better here, just giving Leon a new move he doesn't have by default to help him evade the enemy. And newcomers definitely aren't going to forget being trapped in a very small space with this fucking thing. It's competently made. From one bombastic moment, you head right into another with your reunion with Krauser. The stage has been set with some small puzzles and unique enemies, so once again we get a scenario unlike any other in the game. Newcomers are really unlikely to know just how good the knife is here, so they'll find this segment to be fairly challenging with Krauser's interruption and puzzle solving. This is one of those segments I wish I had gotten someone fresh to play, since knowing the trick greatly reduces difficulty. He's one of the harder bosses to kill, even with the knife trick, since Leon is slow to execute the attack, so there's still some timing that goes into the fight if you're fixated for the knife kill. You can't just recklessly run in and swing like I'm doing here. There's some weird use of the QTEs here, having you respond to Krauser's sass, but other than that, the segment has everything it needs to make another win for RE4's diverse book.
Don't just stand there. Come out and fight like a man.
I'm on vacation.
Just trying to have fun.
Coming off the heels of a boss is the most bombastic progression segment of the game, with ya boy giving you cover fire from a helicopter. This is as modern shooter as it gets. You're fighting your way through enemies, blockades are destroyed, things are exploding. It's standard fare these days, but for the 6th gen, it's very impressive technically. Even with this switch to level layout, there's still the carrot of progression if you can just solve the puzzles standing in your way. Not so much in the beginning, but towards the end of the whole ramp up when you're asked to open a gate under heavy fire. Used sparingly, this stuff's completely fine. As long as my boy doesn't try to make plans with me before we're stateside, we'll be good.
Thanks. When we get out of here, drinks are on me.
Yeah, hey, I know a good bar.
There's one more mandatory firefight with a tougher enemy batch before getting to Ashley one last time. Nothing to say that hasn't already been said, it's just one of the few that's mandatory by design since certain enemies have a specific key. I guess since that's the case, he's your only real target, so no? I guess the whole thing's not mandatory. Silly me. We nab our girl and use a machine to cure ourselves. Not sure why they have this thing, I thought they wanted their terrorism to be permanent. But Jesus Christ, we're finally here.
Something's not right. Ashley, you stay here.
Well, as far as final bosses go, it's the best the series has produced thus far. The mechanics finally complement the type of climactic showdown this series has been pining for up until this point. There's a bit of skill on your positioning and aim, so it's finally not just a stall war where you fire off your most powerful weapons until you're tossed the rocket. I mean, I guess in theory it's the same thing. There's a large threat and you run away to shoot it from a safe distance. That's pretty much every Resident Evil boss, but the use of QTEs and weak points make it more engaging. You don't just run and auto-target and fire, now you have some proper options to play with. The bar wasn't exactly that high for the series, but yeah. It's finally able to pull off the climactic gun battle with some poise. This ending escape sequence will cap off the game, and holy shit, my knees are fucking hurting, and my jaw is sore from doing this for so long. The game fucking gets it. It's got competent movement, competent combat mechanics, competent resources to take advantage of those mechanics. It knows how to arrange things to create fresh encounters throughout that experience, and all on 6th gen hardware. It's nearly fucking perfect, and you'd be hard pressed to find a game that throws up this many ideas this frequently, this consistently good. It's not a mystery why it's good though. They knew what they had there gameplay wise, and they just stuck to their guns the whole way. They found ways to change things around their core mechanics while still ensuring all changes capitalized on the core mechanics. It's just good. Not even just good. It's nearly fucking perfect.
Right, Leon? Not quite. I still have to get you home safe.
Fuck these videos.
Dr. High Hopes.